Hi, everyone. Welcome to Module 8. In this module, we're covering styling your speech. When we talk about style, we're thinking more about our use of language and using language to effectively accomplish your goals for your speech, more so than we're talking about organization. We talked about that in earlier units, why you need an introduction and a conclusion, how your body should be aligned with its main points and transitions on either end, things like that. Now we're talking about the nitty gritty and the actual words that you're using within those pieces of your speech structure. There are several things that differentiate oral and written communication. And when you're preparing your speeches for this class, it's important to remember that you're preparing speeches for the ear. This means that people are listening to you give your speech, but at no point will they read a transcript of it. And this kind of affects the way that you will prepare for it and deliver it in ways that you may not initially think about. There are a lot of similarities between speeches and papers, but the way that we speak is far more casual typically and far more repetitive than the way that we write or the way we should write. There's more repetition and transitions because we are trying to reinforce an idea and we're trying to build a flow from one point to another because people can't go back and forth. They don't have the speech in front of them. They can't flip back to page one and say, what did he say about that? What did she say about that? What were they talking about when they defined this word? So that's why we have to repeat things. If they miss it the first time, we need to repeat it so that they get it the second time. Or if we're trying to persuade them, which we'll talk a little bit more about specifically in our persuasive unit, you need to repeat it so that the idea sticks with them and they're more likely to listen to your argument. A couple other minor differences that may or may not always apply are that when we speak, we typically use personal pronouns like I or we. When you're writing, particularly in academic writing, you don't encounter that as often. When you read a research paper for one of your classes, it will probably say the research team, then blah, 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 or the participants were interviewed by a trained interviewer, and that's the person writing the paper usually. But they don't use I or we, and so you kind of have to flip that when you're writing your speech, but it seems to be kind of natural to write speeches that way anyways, so it's a benefit in a lot of ways. And then also we're striving for simplicity, and that makes sense because people are listening. They only have the limited ability to process so much on the spot in live time. So you don't want to complicate things too much. Make it simple and effective. You want it to be easy for them to remember. And then use short sentences and contractions when possible. Oftentimes, these are more effective, anyways. We have concrete and abstract language. Concrete is specific, tangible, and definite. So you know what a water bottle is, or a book, or a piece of paper. You know what the United States are. You know what Texas is, a state, a country, a continent. You have an idea of what those things are. Whereas abstract language, you may have some kind of idea of how it may be interpreted, but it doesn't have a set definition. For example, democracy, freedom, love, peace. You know in your mind that there are things that are supposed to symbolize those, but there's no kind of universal answer as to what those are. So just be aware of which of the two you're using and why, and if you need to switch them out. Vivid imagery, which I'm sure you've talked about multiple times between elementary school and now in English class or a literature class, maybe even a creative writing or composition class. And these are words that bring the senses into play. So they're descriptors, they're adjectives, and they kind of add some color and some sparkle to our speech, but then also to the picture that we're painting for our listeners. Some suggestions are try modifying nouns with a descriptive adjective. So instead of saying we have a cat, you'd say we have an orange cat that is small and fluffy. Or use active verb forms. She runs, she is running, as opposed to she ran. Figures of speech, you've encountered these as well, I'm sure. Some of them are more popular than others. Some are easier to use than others. A simile is a comparison using like or as. She is like a model, or he is like a linebacker. Metaphor, comparison without like or as. So if you think of The Fault in Our Stars, and he's holding the cigarette between his teeth, and he says, "You put the killing thing there. You don't give it the power to kill you." It's a metaphor. At no point does he say, "This is like my life." He just kind of makes the comparison and alludes to that. Analogy would be a comparison that is in two parts. So socks are to feet as gloves are to hands. Personification, giving human-like traits to something that is not human. Understatement, exactly what it sounds like. You probably do this all the time, where you talk about a situation, but not to the degree that it's actually occurring. So you could have said, it was cold in Texas a couple weeks ago. And that doesn't quite cover the winter storm, right? Irony is something you probably won't use in this course. We're focused more on giving some professional and polished speeches, but you may use irony if you're doing stand-up comedy, or if you're working with a crowd that you know really well. Otherwise, I would avoid trying to be ironic. Allusion is when you mention some kind of pop culture reference or some kind of historical reference that people would be familiar with. So you could say something about Caesar or Lady Gaga, and people will know who you're talking about if you do it correctly. If you pick someone too obscure, it may not come off as well. Hyperbole is the opposite of understatement. It's exaggeration. So you could say the sandwich I got at Subway was as big as a whale, right? It's an exaggeration. And then onomatopoeia is when a word sounds like the sound that it's supposed to represent. So bark, swoop, things like that. Building credibility and using words appropriately. So kind of like I said, you may not want to use irony in this course. You want to match formality to the occasion. So if you're speaking to a kindergarten class, it doesn't need to be like a Nobel Prize acceptance speech. It's not going to go over well. And vice versa. If you're giving a Nobel Prize acceptance speech and it sounds like you're speaking to a kindergarten class, then we're in trouble, right? There's something called code switching that is covered in your textbook, but you're welcome to read more on it outside of that as well. But it basically refers to the use of dialect, and it builds relationship. It kind of says to the person, I am like you, or we are part of the same community. And you're able to communicate that way. For example, if you're speaking to your peers, you may say something like, that's lit, or it's lit. And if you said that to somebody at a nursing home, they're not going to know what that means unless their grandchildren have told them, right? So it's kind of like a code that you have with people who will understand what you're saying. Use your words accurately. Misuse causes audiences to lose confidence. This hopefully won't be a super big problem in this course because you have quite a bit of flexibility about what topics you choose to cover. At no point do I say, okay, I want you to give me a speech about the phases of the moon. That's not relevant to all of you, and it's not something that will typically happen in your career. You'll almost always be speaking about something that you're at least familiar with. But in the event that you aren't, If you don't know how to pronounce something, look it up, have the internet tell you how to pronounce it. Google will do that for you. If you don't know what a word is and you look it up and you're still not sure if you're using it correctly, pick a different word. We can use the active voice. This makes your statements clear and assertive. Active verbs, again, run, running, passing. Whereas passive verb, the subject is act upon, ran or will be running, or she will run. And honestly, I don't think you'll end up using a bunch of passive verbs in your speeches. It just picks whatever works best for you and stick to one thing, right? You don't want to say Exxon is blank, 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 and then halfway through your speech switch to Exxon was or Exxon did, unless you're referring back to something later on. Long story short, I know that part's confusing. Just make sure that you're using consistency in tense, and you should be good there. As always, we've talked about this before, but just make sure that you're using culturally sensitive and gender neutral language when you can. Language should be respectful of the audience. And when we use language to build style, sometimes we don't consider potential meanings or pitfalls that may come out of that. So just be aware. This is why I say practice your speech in front of people. They'll catch something if it sounds fishy. So just be respectful of cultural beliefs, norms, traditions, and the way that you're using words. Building a lasting impression. This is particularly important for your training and briefing speech, but also for your persuasive speech. Because the idea is that we want the audience to walk away with something and having learned from your speech, right? In the instance of the training and briefing speech, you're either telling them about an event and giving them a call to action, asking them to do something about it, or you're recounting the event in a way that is supposed to make it easier for them to understand if it's complicated. And so we want to build an impression so that they are leaving the conversation or listening to your speech rather more understanding of the situation at hand than when they came in. And some ways that we can do that are to use repetition. We talked about that earlier, but repetition is key in terms of getting people to remember something. And there are a couple different ways to repeat your information. The first being anaphora, that's repeating an early phrase or clause or sentence. So if you think of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, I have a dream, insert here. I have a dream, insert here. So he would repeat that phrase and then follow it with the rest of the stanza that he was reciting. Epiphora is similar. You're repeating words or phrases at the end of successive statements. So I like pizza, you like pizza, we like pizza, Pizza Hut, 50% off, right? So just the reverse. And if it helps you to remember A, beginning of the alphabet, E, the epiphora is also epilogue, right? The end of the book. Use alliteration. This one should be familiar to you from an English course in the past. We're repeating sounds within or at the beginning of the word. So alliteration, big blue bridge, B, 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 downward dog, D, D. You could also do phone home, like ET, and that O sound is repeated. There are a couple different ways that people will name internal sounds of the word, but for the sake of this course and for understanding what alliteration is, just recognize it as repeating sounds in your word. That is it for Module 8. As always, if you have questions or if I can be of service, please let me know. And I hope that this is helpful for you as you're polishing up your speeches for training and briefing unit. I'll see you soon. Be well.